For the lab assignments, the focus of these is on adding exception handling. I'm giving you code for the first couple exercises, and then we're going to use some of your older programs. And if you don't have those anymore, you can copy mine. So this first one, basically it's a little program that calculates BMI. And so you can see we're entering the height and weight. And then we are making sure that they enter an integer for height. And for weight, we are also making sure that they enter an integer. And then we are going to validate those numbers. So you're going to put this little validation section in a try block. You can see I've got a comment where you should begin the try block and where you should end it. And then after the try block is where you are going to create your catch block. Okay, so you are going to create a new program, copy and paste this in. And then for the catch blocks, you're going to create two of them, invalid data exception, and then you're going to do a generic catch. So you'll do a catch for invalid data and a generic catch. So you're going to add those try blocks. Below that, you'll add one try block. Below that, you're going to add two catch blocks. You do need to do invalid data exception first. You always do the more specific ones. And then the last one you should code is the generic. So you'll do invalid data exception first, and then you'll do the generic. And then below that, you will put a finally block. And I've already shown you what to put inside the try block. And there are a couple lines of code that you are going to have to replace. So instead of, displaying that the height is out of range and the weight is out of range, this is where you need to throw the error. So you are going to throw new, and the type of error is invalid data exception. So you'll code throw new invalid data exception, and then in parentheses, you can pretty much keep the same message. Okay, so this line has to change and this line has to change. Then at this location, you're going to have a catch for invalid data exception, and below that, you will have a generic catch. Now, the code that actually calculates and displays the BMI should always run. So it needs to run regardless of if there is an exception or not. And that is this code. So you are going to place that code in the finally block. Okay, and so since this is the first one that you've done on your own, if you scroll down, you can see how that should look. So you can make sure you've done it correctly, and then you can go ahead and test it. For exercise 2, I am giving you some code, and the code does not have exception handling in it. Okay, so if you look at the code, you can see that we have an account name. We've got some double values, beginning balance, end balance, and temporary check. We have a size, and then we have a double list. And just a minute, I think this may have changed. Let me see if I can reload it. Pretty sure I changed that to accounts. Hold on a minute, or checks, just a second. All right, this looks better. So our double list is called checks. That's pretty what I thought. And so here we've still got beginning balance and ending balance. And I have a little note up here that if you are doing try and catch, and you want to be able to use the variables outside of the try, catch, and the finally, you need to declare them above the try. Okay, because otherwise we have scope problems. So that is kind of my helpful hint. So this is basically the code that could cause exceptions because this is where we are asking them for input. Now you'll notice that when we are reading the input in, that I have a method that I created called validate string. I have another method called validate double, and it's sending the input to those methods. So let's take a look at what they do. So down here, I have validate double, and it's bringing in the string from the console. And then I've got a little try parse here. And once it is actually a double value, I'm making sure that it is not less than or equal to 0. Okay, so um, by the time we get out of the loop, it is a double number and it is not less than or equal to 0. That number gets returned and that number will go here. And for the account name, it goes through this validate string. And we're just making sure that it's not null or empty. And if it is, they have to keep re-entering it until there's a string there. And then we return the value. And that goes in here. Okay. So we are doing some validation up front. And then we've got our beginning balance. We set that equal to the ending balance. And then we get into some check processing. So how many checks you want to enter. And here we've got our validation loop. And we are making sure that it's an integer and that it is not less than or equal to 0. Okay. And so once we figure out how many they want to enter, we have a little for loop that will process all of those checks. And so we have enter the check amount, and that should be a double value. So we're sending our string right to validate double to make sure that it's a double number and not less than or equal to 0. Okay, we store it here, and then we are adding it to our list. Okay, after we add it to the list, we subtract it from the ending balance. Okay, so that is pretty much the program at this point. You will also notice that there is a print summary where we're basically sending it kind of all our information. We're sending it the account name, the list of checks, the beginning balance, the ending balance, and then we are printing out a summary of the account. We're printing out all those values. Okay, so that is the program as it is. We have to place all the code that could cause an exception in the try block. Below the try block, we're going to have 2 catch blocks. And then below the 2 catch blocks, we're going to do a finally block. So the modifications that we need to make. We need to add a try block. And the try block is basically going to be, we don't want the variable declarations in there. So all of this is going to be in the try block. At the bottom of the try block, insert 2 if statements that check for an error condition and throw arithmetic exception errors. So what are the 2 error conditions that we could possibly have here? They could be overdrawn or their balance could be 0. Okay, so those are the 2 errors that we are going to check for. So after we're all done with this processing at the bottom of our try, so we're still in the try block, we are going to check the ending balance to see if it is equal to 0. And then we're going to throw an arithmetic exception indicating that their current balance is 0 and they need to deposit more money. The other if statement we are going to create is going to check to see if the ending balance is less than 0. And if it's less than 0, we need to throw an arithmetic exception that they are overdrawn and they will be assessed, a fee. And if you guys want to say $50 fee or whatever, go ahead. Whatever fee you want to assess them for being overdrawn. Okay, so we are going to be throwing arithmetic exceptions here. So after you code those two if statements, the next thing that you are going to do is code your two catch blocks. And so the first one is going to be the more specific one for the arithmetic exception. And then the second one will be for the generic exception, which will handle any other runtime error. And then in the finally block, that should print out the summary of activity. And it needs to print every time the program runs, even if there is no exception. So you will have below your try block, you'll have the two catch blocks, and you will have a finally block. The finally block should call this print summary method and pass the data to the method. Okay, and so the code that you are entering should look like this. And then these are examples of what your output should look like. For the third exercise, we are going to take two of our earlier programs and we are going to add exception handling to them. So if you no longer have those programs, you can copy the code from mine, or you can use yours. So if you have Chapter 6 My Arrays, you can rename the project folder and call it Chapter 10 EX3 Exception Handling 1. That is not going to rename the program itself. It's just going to rename your project folder, okay, which is fine. Or, if you want to create a brand new one, copy your old code into your new one, you can do that. Or you can start with mine, okay? It doesn't matter, but this is one of our old exercises. And so these are kind of simple little programs. Okay, so we created a couple arrays, we populated the array, and we print from the array. Okay, so pretty simple little exercise. And we're going to do a try block around all the code in the main method because it is conceivable that all of this could create an exception. And actually, it's more this part that could create the exception. Although we are reading from the council, I would put all of it in a try block. Okay? All of it could flag an exception. Then below the try block, we're going to have two catch blocks. We're going to have a format exception. And this can happen if we enter the wrong data type here. Okay, and then you're going to do the default exception below that. For the format exception, you should print the message property of the exception object. So you're going to kind of code this like the arithmetic exception and the invalid data exception that we just did. Okay, so here we have an arithmetic exception. we created an object and we printed out the message, you're going to do the same thing, except for yours is going to be a format exception instead of an arithmetic exception. And then this is the default block. So you're basically doing the same thing here. And then for the finally block, just display a message that, have a great day. And normally I wouldn't even have you code that, but it's nice for you to see the message, then you know that it went through the finally block. So you're going to run the program and enter invalid data. So you're going to try running text instead of numbers. C# is going to throw a format exception. And so you can kind of see how this looks. So here I did it for dues, but you would also trigger it on the number of items. Okay, and so this is the message coming from ex.message. This is coming from the finally block, or this is coming from the finally block. And then here is another example. How many items would you like to enter? And so I entered a number that was way too big. So this is actually going to generate an overflow exception. And that is not one that we specifically handled, right? Because we have the format exception and a default exception. So this is an overflow exception, but it'll run through the default because we did not specify overflow. Okay, and so it's still, if we print the message coming from C#, it's still going to tell us that basically the number is too big. Okay, and then for the last exercise, this is from chapter 3. And if you have it, you can rename the project folder. Otherwise, you can create a new one and you can simply copy mine or copy yours. And so this was the frequent shopper discount program, for those of you that remember this one. And so we're going to add a little exception handling to this. So all the code in our main method is going to be inside the try block. Below the try block, we're going to add 4 catch blocks. We're going to do a format exception, an overflow exception, an invalid data exception, and the default exception. For the format exception and the overflow exception, you're going to print the message property of the exception object. So this is exactly what you did in the previous exercises. And so that would be actually also the invalid data exception, all 3 of them. Okay. For the default exception, you can just code it like our previous default exceptions. Okay, so no difference here. Then you are going to modify the nested if else. And the very last line where we were setting the discount equal to 0.05, we are now going to throw an exception that they entered an invalid PIN. After the amount spent has been entered, we are going to check to see if the value is less than or equal to 0. And if it is, we are going to throw an invalid data exception. So the prompt is already in there. How much did you spend? We are already reading it in. And then we are going to do a check. So if they spent less than or equal to 0, that is where we are throwing the exception. So you're going to have to add that code. Okay, and then at this point, we have our try block complete. We have all of our catch blocks complete, and you're going to add a finally block. And then that should just display a message, have fun shopping or whatever. And then you are going to run the program and enter invalid data to test your exception handling. So you should try to enter text for a PIN for the PIN number, in which case you should get the format exception. You should enter a PIN less than 100. where you're going to get that generic exception that we're throwing, because that means the PIN is invalid. You're going to enter an amount spent less than zero, which should throw the invalid data exception. You're going to enter text for the amount spent, okay, which would give you a format exception. And then for the PIN, enter a huge number, and that will trigger overflow exception. So you're going to need to run this thing at least 6 times. You're going to want to run it one time where there's no problems, and then the other 5 times you are specifically looking for errors. Okay, and so I do have an example of what those error conditions look like. And you can see here is a bad format. And you can tell in my finally black, I have happy shopping. So you can see what is coming from the exception handling. Okay, so that is the last exercise. And so you will be turning that one in and give yourself a pat on the back because you are now done with lab assignments.